All right. So welcome everyone. I thank you once again for joining us for another one of these weekly Wednesday Lunch and Learn webinars. This one's a little different. It's about statistical analysis in the HR world, and the ideas of using employee data not just to improve retention, but to understand different aspects of employee information. So I'll try and walk you through a couple of these examples. First, I wanted to give a little bit of some basic principles related to continuous improvement, just to get some foundational points across. So when you think of operational improvement, just in general, whether it's production or some other department, usually you're asking a couple of questions, right? You're asking, first of all, what is the output or the why that you're trying to understand or that you're trying to improve, for example. And then once you understand what is that output that you're trying to improve or get a handle on, then you're getting into, well, what are the levers, what are the inputs, what are the X's that influence that Y? That is, in a nutshell, the principle of when you're trying to improve something. And in statistical language, what you're trying to do is apply different tests and different techniques so that you can say, yes, I found a significant input or significant lever or something that when I control it or when I change it, it actually affects the output. And I want to be at least 95% certain. That's the basic principle of this concept. So the nice thing is that the world of human resources can benefit from the exact same logic, okay? There's no difference. You're still thinking of what are those outputs that you're trying to do, what kind of program are you putting in place, or perhaps you're looking at retention, and what are, in a perfect world, what are the significant factors that influence it, right? The stats tools, the approaches, they're slightly different, of course, but they're just as powerful and just as effective. Now, we'll touch on this throughout the webinar. There's a few points I wanted to bring up right off the bat is, why is it that these techniques, which are so prevalent in just basic continuous improvement, they're really non-existent, or very, very few people use it in human resource type applications? So the first one is fine. It's usually a lack of knowledge that you can use these type of stats tools with HR data. But a lot of times it's the second and the third points on that slide, right? People in general, companies, departments, they're very, very uncomfortable dealing with people data. It just feels like we shouldn't be looking at people data. There's something inherently wrong with doing that, right? They're sometimes concerned about confidentiality information and hiring laws. So I will try and address some of these things. The basic premise I wanted to share at this point is there is nothing wrong with looking at data. Data is just about trying to understand. Okay, and hopefully with the examples I will show you, I will try to demonstrate that point. So we'll look at two case studies with this webinar, and the first one being rolling out a new survey or a new program or initiative, something that you're rolling out across a large organization that has different locations or different departments. So that's case study number one. And case study number two is how to improve retention by looking at things such as departure data. When people are leaving, how long do they stay in a company before they quit a company, for instance. So let's look at the first one. Rolling out a new program. Let's say you have a new benefits program as an example. You're rolling it out through a large company. You have 5 different sites, A, B, C, D, E. And what you do is you send out a survey and you're counting the number of responses that people reply back to you. So you would ask each of the 5 sites, hey, this new program, what do you think? Is it better? Is it the same? Or is it worse? And you'll see this in a couple of times over the next few slides. The question we're actually asking is, are the results significantly different across the sites? Okay. In other words, is the site a significant factor? The site, is it a lever? Is it an X in influencing how people say if it's better, same, or worse? The test you would use here is something called the chi-square test. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into very complicated statistics. If you run this test, the test would come back and say, yes, actually, the site is a significant factor in how people are expressing themselves as either being better, same, or worse. And you see a little bit of a grid underneath of the numbers across the three better, same, and worse categories and the 5 sites A to E. But what does all this mean? This sounds a little bit like gibberish and a lot of jargon. Let's take a step back and let me explain to you the premise of how this test works. The key to this test, and this is why it's so powerful in the HR world, is being able to see the difference between the actual numbers and the expected results in each category. All right. So what does that mean? Expected, exactly how does that all work? So let's look at something that's non-technical. I think maybe a lot of you follow sports, whatever your favorite sport happens to be. So imagine your team has a star athlete, and when that star athlete is playing, your sports team has, for example, 20 wins and 4 losses. So if you do the math, they win about 83% of the time. What usually happens when someone reports on this, let's say it's a sportscaster or on television, they will automatically say, hey, you know what? This is an important factor. The star athlete obviously is important because when they're playing, their team wins 83% of the time. Therefore, it's a significant factor. But hopefully, as you go through some of this information, and when you start playing around with using statistics, you start asking, and your little voice starts talking to you, is that necessarily true, the conclusion that you see above in the slide? You actually need to know something else to arrive to that conclusion, right? You need to know what happens when the same star athlete is not playing. So if I gave you this example at the bottom where I say, you know what, when that star athlete is not playing, your favorite sports team now has 10 wins and 2 losses, which is exactly the same win ratio of 83%. What would be your conclusion now? So your conclusion now would be a little different. You say, you know what? It seems actually that my team is a good team and wins 83% of the time, regardless of whether this athlete is playing or not. So all of a sudden, your conclusion changes, and you would say that this is not a significant result. Okay. This is the premise of using this type of test with HR data. So now when I go back to the same data that I showed you a few slides ago, you would apply this chi-square test, and the test basically tries to calculate the difference between the actual number of people that said, for example, the survey is better or the benefit package is better, and what is expected. Okay, so the program, the stats program actually tries to figure out, you had this many people, but it should have been this many people according to the stat. So now you can start seeing which sites generate results which are much different than expected. So I want to show you one example so that you can get a better feel for it. So if we look at site C, they had 12 people who said, you know what, this new benefits package, I don't see a difference. It seems the same. I don't feel it being better or worse. 12. The statistic says that number should have been 26 people. The number should have been much, much larger in terms of the number of people who said it was the same. Conversely, if you look at worse, 32 people at site C said, I'm not happy with this benefit package. It's not very good. I think it's actually worse than what we had before. And the expectation, according to this test, according to this model, was that only 15 people should have said it was worse. So these numbers are very, very much different from each other. We have a lot more people saying worse and a lot less people saying the same. Okay. So what happens here is you would look at this, you would run the test. The stat test would say basically, yes, it's a significant factor, 95% sure that the site has a strong bearing on the results. And you get to this conclusion. For example, site C has more people saying that the benefit package is worse than expected. And you see what I have written on the bottom of the slide is, okay, you've done this test. And then, of course, most people would say, well, why is that? Well, that would be the next phase of your project, right? So if this is your department or if this is your company, this is as far as the statistic will take you. The stat basically tells you, yes, I found the significant factor, which is site. We seem to have something going on, not just with site C, but if you look at site B as well. I need to go and visit. I need to pick up the phone. I need to investigate what is going on that's causing a disconnect between what is actually being produced in results and what I expected the results to be. So that's one example of how to use statistics for HR type data. The other one I wanted to talk about is retention. So, for example, your company is having issues with retention, which in turn is causing issues with your ability to sustain production or expand your production. Of course, if you have people quitting left, right, and center, that does cause havoc on your production issues, right? So the question here is, can we look at existing HR data to better understand what's happening? And very, very clear, the answer is yes. You can definitely look at it. I will touch on some of those points in a second. You would use here a slightly different test or something called an ANOVA test, as well as a few graphing techniques to be able to easily come up with some conclusions with retention data. So same idea. Let me talk a little bit on some background, just a little bit, not to belabor the point. The key here is to look at numerical data, but you're looking at it sort of grouped by category or type. This idea of grouping can be very, very powerful when you're looking at this type of data and using an ANOVA concept. So you still have the same ideas of outputs. So your output is numerical data. In this example, your Y or your output is how long someone stays with the company before departing. Are they leaving within 3 months? Are they leaving within 3 years? Are they leaving within 13 years, right? So that would be your output. And then your input are all these, I call it a wealth of information that usually exists and we don't do anything with it. So if you look at a large company, in this case, this particular case, it could be something that has people coming in from different parts of the country because it could be a fly in, fly out type of operation. So you can have information on where they come from, what is their home city or their home province. You can have their ages or age groups. You can have gender. You can have education. You can have department. You can have lots and lots of information associated with each person that has left your company, for instance. And this goes back to something I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is an example of some of the discomfort starting to creep in, right? We start looking at people data. There's a lot of pushback that I do get on the ability to look at those different X's. And the best explanation I can give, just as a high level answer, is the idea of applying these stats is you're trying to understand. That's all it's about. You're striving to understand what it is that's affecting how long people are staying with your company, right? This is not about excluding a group. So if you're having an issue with a certain home province or certain age group that are leaving very quickly, the idea is not to ignore that group, but the opposite, right? You're trying to understand why they're leaving. So I'm going to go and investigate. Why is it that that group is not sticking around? What is it about my company or how I onboard or how I embrace them in the company that's causing them to leave prematurely? That is the spirit of this type of analysis. So let's look at actual information. So here we have the same idea of years with the company before the person departs. And let's say we look at it from an age group perspective. So we can have, in this example, we decided to group them by 3 different categories of ages. You have young adult, and seniors. And you define it however it makes most sense in terms of your own company and your own situation. So what you start seeing here is you have the 3 categories running from left to right. And on going up from the bottom to top is the number of years they tend to stay on average before they depart. And what you start seeing here is the statistic would come back as being significant. And even visually, you start seeing, wow, we obviously have a problem. Young adults tend to leave much, much quicker than adults and seniors, right? Almost a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 factor between the 3 groups. So the same as before, you would do this test, you would find out that it's significant. And then you might say, well, why is it? Why are young adults leaving within a couple of years? I don't know the answer to that question, right? So if this is your area, you would take that as the next phase of your project. You would have investigation. You would maybe have, sometimes people do exit interviews. You have maybe surveys that are a little bit more tailor-made and customized with this information in mind. You're not just asking generic questions, you're asking questions specific to the situation, okay? So that's one aspect of using ANOVA type test to understand what is going on with your retention data. Here's another one. It's not using anything fancy. It's just using graphical techniques, right? So you're using graphical techniques to see, hey, if I plot all the people that have left, and there's ways of normalizing the data to make sure you're looking at it properly. And I want to see, for instance, the number of people that are leaving based on the different amount of time I stay with the company. So what you have there at the bottom is anywhere from 0 all the way to 25, for instance. And the height of the bar represents the number of people that have left your company in that bucket, basically, right? So again, there's a lot of other information that's not shown here, but at a high level, you start seeing things like, hey, I see two peaks in my workforce in terms of people leaving. There's one peak that happens at 5-year mark, and another peak that happens around the 11 or 12-year mark. Same thing applies, right? Now, this is information. I have an issue, I have a problem with people leaving at specific times of their time with our company. Why is that? I don't know why that is. That would be part of the next phase of the project, which is either a combination of speaking to people, or in this case, there's also other data that can shine a light as to why this is happening. You can imagine that people leave within 5 years for totally different reasons than why people leave at the 11 or 12-year mark, right? At the 11 or 12-year mark, you may have things more in tune with job promotions or opportunities, or maybe being bored being in the same job for too long, versus at the 5-year mark, which maybe has more to do with salary, as an example, right? So things that happen at different phases or different age groups or different categories help you to try to better understand why it is people are leaving your company. And just as a final point with this slide is HR companies have a lot, or HR departments have a lot of responsibility and challenge now, in that there used to be a one-size-fits-all in terms of benefit packages or strategies, and that has changed over the years, right? You have to be able to understand your people and your labor pool, so that you can have strategies that are very specific for the different groups of people in your company. All right, so that's all I wanted to get into in terms of a high level. These are real case studies. Of course, the numbers have been cleaned up so as to protect the client themselves. But these are actual situations that were used, and real numbers that were applied, these type of statistics, to better understand the situation. So hopefully I was able to show a couple of examples where these type of analytical tools that are already known outside of the HR world can be recognized as being very powerful, but they're actually very underutilized in HR departments in the HR world. There's a lot of information that HR usually has. It can be put to better use. You can still look at protecting confidentiality issues, especially with the concept of we're aiming to understand. That's the real purpose of looking at this data. We're not trying to, point fingers. We're not trying to eliminate different groups of people from being hired. I want to understand why my benefit package is not working with certain groups or certain departments. I want to understand why certain people are not staying with my company. Once I can understand it, then I can improve it. And as a final point is at our company, Analyze Improve, we have numerous clients that are willing to work together with us so that we look at their data. We try to better understand the data and suggest improvements in whatever their case may be. So obviously, feel free to contact us either at the email below or directly with myself. So thank you very much for your time. I'll open it up. I'll stop sharing my screen in a second, but I'll open it up to any questions that people may have.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
In your first example where you were talking about the benefits package,
Yes.
and when you talked about expected count, where did you get that number from?
Yeah, so that is a good question. So that's essentially when I mentioned this test, this chi-square test, it's a specific distribution, And what it does is the software, in my case, I use Minitab. There are other softwares that do it for you. What it does in just plain English, it looks at all the rows and all the columns, and then says, if I kind of equalize that distribution, I would expect these numbers to be these ones below. So it's done by a software basically, but that's how it does it. It runs left to right and up and down and says, all things being equal, if the site was not significant and the answers are not significant, I would expect the numbers below to be the case that what I would see basically. So the stat does it for you. Otherwise, this would be very difficult and a complex formula to run yourself.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And you probably noticed, I mean, I selected Site C as being the largest discrepancy between actual and expected, but there are other ones as well. So if we look at Site B, they had 7 people saying that it was worse, and it should have been 19. So actually, that's the reverse conclusion. There's many less people, if that's a sentence, there's less people from Site B thinking it's worse. So they're the opposite of Site C. So that's another way you could investigate. If this was your department, you would say, I need to see what's different between B and C, that I'm getting kind of polar opposites with respect to the worse conclusion. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any comments? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, you know the drill. We will have this on our YouTube channel. So if you or anybody else that you know would like to see it, you can go to it. And I would like to thank you basically for taking some of your lunch hour to spend it with me. And please get back to me if you have any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carmen.
Bye, Carmen.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you very much. Merci, Léon. Comment ça va?
Ça va bien, et toi?
Excellent. Merci beaucoup. En forme?